So we are at the Woodmere Cemetery. We are looking for the gravesite of a Ms. Rose Verez. Was she an innocent woman sent to prison for 13 years for crimes she did not commit? Or was she a serial killer who got away with murder? We're going to find out. On August 23, 1931, 68-year-old Steve Mack was rushed to the hospital in Detroit, Michigan after allegedly falling from a ladder at the boarding house where he lived. He died 2 days later from his injuries. The owner of the boarding house, her name was Rose Verez, told police she had asked Steve Mack to repair an attic window and that he had fallen off the ladder while doing so. Upon investigation, police discovered that Rose had taken out an insurance policy on Steve Mack's life. John Walker, who rented the other half of the house that Rose operated as a boarding house, told police he had seen Rose and her 18-year-old son William beat Mack, carry him up to the attic, and toss him out the window. John Walker also claimed that Rose had offered him $500 to keep quiet about what he had seen. The rumor around Rose's neighborhood had long been that Rose was a witch. Rose was a Hungarian immigrant and spoke very little English. She was sometimes referred to as the Witch of Delray. Delray was a neighborhood in Detroit back in the 1930s. This neighborhood was similar to what Detroit calls now Greektown and Corktown. She was blamed by the neighborhood for all of the misfortunes that happened in Detroit during that time during the Great Depression, but she actually never performed any type of witchcraft. Prior to Steve Mack's death, 11 other men living in Rose's house had died. Some were from alcohol poisoning, others from natural causes, and still others appeared to have hanged themselves, committing suicide. Some of these men were even married to Rose at the time of their deaths. In one instance, 6 years prior to Steve Mack's death, Rose had been questioned in connection with the death of one of the men, but it was later determined that he had died from natural causes. Rose had reportedly collected on life insurance policies she had taken out on some of the other deceased boarders as well. Newspapers quickly ran with the story of an alleged witch whose boarder died mysterious deaths, and it was widely covered in the news stories across the country. The boarding house she ran were rooms mostly to men. Most were immigrants. Others just wanted to get out of their homes for whatever reason. The women in the neighborhood were upset that she was taking away their men per se, and that they had told their children to be home before dark so the Witch of Delray would not come for them. Several days after police began investigating Steve Mack's death and Rose's possible involvement, the assistant prosecutor reported that Rose had admitted to her friend that she had pushed Steve Mack out of the window after several attempts to poison him had failed. On September 1st, 1931, Rose and her son were charged with the murder. 2 of her other boarders were also arrested. The police claimed they had been responsible for also attempting to poison Steve Mack prior to his death. The trial of Rose Verez and her son began on October 1st, 1931. At the trial, the state produced evidence of 2 insurance policies totaling $5,200 on Steve Mack's life, paid for and benefiting Rose. Evidence of approximately 75 insurance policies taken out by Rose on the lives of her boarders was also admitted as evidence. John Walker, Rose's neighbor, testified that Rose had attempted to have Steve Mack poisoned and that she and her son had thrown him out the window when the attempted poisonings failed. An 11-year-old neighbor girl, Marie Chavala, testified that she had been playing on her lawn across the street from Rose's house when she witnessed Rose and her son throw Steve Mack from the attic window. Several other neighbors testified as well, including Bessie Hill, who stated that after Steve Mack fell, Rose had come to her house in a disheveled state, asking for a towel to wash her hands and face. The prosecution relied on Bessie Hill's testimony as support for its argument that Rose and her son had first beaten Steve Mack in the basement before pushing him out the attic window. The defense maintained that Steve Mack had accidentally fallen when repairing the window and that Rose and her son had not been involved in his death. Rose's attorney argued that it was customary for boarding house operators to take out insurance policy on the lives of their boarders. Both Rose and her son were found guilty on October 5, 1931, and both sentenced to life in prison. But in May 1944, which is 13 years later, William Verez, Rose's son, was granted a new trial, though the basis for the new trial was not specified in the newspaper articles back then. The prosecutor then requested that the charges against William Verez be dismissed, stating that most of the necessary witnesses could not be located for the retrial since it was 13 years later. The judge dismissed the charges and Rose's son was freed. But then 5 months later, in October 1944, Rose Verez, who was now represented by a new attorney, filed a motion for a new trial as well. The motion was based both on the claim that Rose had been largely unable to understand English at the time of her arrest and trial, as well as the evidence that the judge at the previous trial had not even been in the courtroom at the time the murder verdict was returned. So in April 1945, the judge granted Rose a new retrial. The retrial of Rose Verez began in late November 1945. Neighbor John Walker testified again to the same story he told at Rose's first trial. Marie Chavala, that 11-year-old girl who is now 24, also testified to the story, witnessing Steve Mack's fatal fall. However, when neighbor Bessie Hill was called to testify again, she fully denied her testimony from the original trial. Rose also testified in her own defense, using an interpreter to translate her words from Hungarian to English. In December 1945, Rose Verez was acquitted and released after 14 years in prison. Now, going back to the deaths that occurred at the boarding house, this was back during the Great Depression in the late 1920s until the end of World War II in 1941. This was also the early time of Prohibition. People consumed questionable types of alcohol, which could have resulted in illness or even death. Men were also away from their families and depressed because they were out of work and had no income, which may have resulted in their apparent suicide. Some also had died from natural causes, but back then they could have died from carbon monoxide poisoning, and it could not be detected in their system because medical technology was not as advanced as it is today. So the cause of death in some may have been declared natural causes. Rose died in August of 1960 at the age of 82. So we actually did find the grave of Rose Verez, wife and mother Rose Verez, born December 26, 1877, died August 14th, 1960. And does look like somebody was here because there are flowers here. And this looks like her husband. This might have been her first husband because she was married multiple times. Husband and father, Gabor Verez, born January 5th, 1891, died January 2nd, 1927. So maybe it was their children putting flowers on their graves. It's possible. So this is the site.
This is the old neighborhood called Delray. It's no longer a neighborhood.
And this is where Rose Verez's boarding house was.
Yep, I'll show you right here.
It's now, what is it?
An empty lot.
An empty lot.
So her house would have been right here in this little fenced-in area.
Wow.
No longer. So it used to be a neighborhood, now it's just a bunch of empty fields and one house behind us, and that's it.